Don't come back here again." Jessica's voice was sharp enough to cut through the morning air. She had my grandson balanced on her hip, his small hand reaching toward me. I froze, gripping the doorframe as if holding on could somehow keep me in their lives. "Please," I whispered. "Just let me hug him once more." Her eyes narrowed. She shifted the boy higher against her shoulder, pulling him back from me as if I carried some invisible disease. The sound of the lock clicking into place came a second later. Final and merciless. Behind her stood my son, my James. The boy I raised on my own, who cried into my arms when his father left us, who swore he'd never let me feel abandoned again. His head was lowered, eyes fixed on the floor. He didn't speak. He didn't even look at me. "James." I tried, but my voice cracked. He flinched like the sound of my voice was too heavy to carry. Jessica glanced back at him, her lips curling into that smug little smile, and he said nothing. Not a word for his mother. The door slammed so hard it rattled in the frame. I stumbled backward, stunned, staring at the chipped paint, as if it could explain what had just happened. Then came the muffled sound through the wood. "Grandma." The small, questioning voice of my grandson reached me, faint but clear enough to break me in two. I pressed my hand against the door, desperate to answer, but Jessica's voice rose to cover his sharper, now commanding. His call was cut short. I stood there in silence for a moment longer, the weight of 5 years pressing down on me in an instant. Finally, I turned and walked away. The gravel crunching under my shoes, sounding louder than my own breath. My chest felt hollow, as if I had left everything I was behind that door. By the time I reached the edge of the driveway, the house already looked smaller, distant, like it had never belonged to me at all. I kept walking, unsure of where to go, but knowing this exile would mark the beginning of a new chapter in my life. My name is Salandra Miles. I am 66 years old, a retired textile worker, and a widow living in a modest rental on the edge of town in Ohio. The house is quiet, too quiet, the kind of silence that wraps around you and reminds you of everything missing. Sunday used to mean laughter, the clatter of dishes, the voices of family rising and falling like music. Now it means sitting at a small kitchen table with one plate, one fork, one glass of water. The seat across from me, the one I always saved for James when he was a boy, stays empty. I trace that emptiness back to the day his father died. James was only 8. I became mother and father, both working nights at the textile mill, stitching uniforms and upholstery by day, taking in hemming jobs for neighbors on weekends. I skipped meals so James could have new sneakers for school, hid my hunger behind a smile so he'd never see the price I paid to keep him whole. I thought those sacrifices built a bond no one could break. But bonds can be rewritten, apparently. One by one, I stopped being invited to the birthdays. The first year, I told myself they must have forgotten. The second year, I baked a cake anyway, just in case they called. By the third, I stopped trying. Holidays came and went without my name on a single invitation. I saw pictures online. My grandson at the park at school plays at Christmas in matching pajamas, and I wasn't there. Neighbors would ask casually, "Don't you see him much these days?" I learned to answer with a tight smile, something vague about how busy young families get. What I never said was how it felt to walk past the toy aisle at the grocery store and keep my hands at my sides because buying gifts he would never open hurt too much. The pain of invisibility does not come all at once. It creeps in a missed phone call here, a forgotten holiday there, until suddenly you realize you've been erased. And I began to wonder how many times a mother can be erased before she disappears entirely. 5 years passed in silence, each one heavier than the last. I kept telling myself that maybe James would come around, that maybe Jessica would soften, that someday the phone would ring and I'd hear my grandson's voice again. But the phone never rang. The mailbox stayed empty. Seasons shifted, but my exile did not. One evening after another dinner alone, I pulled out the small box I kept at the back of my dresser. Inside were photographs my son as a boy, my husband smiling in his Sunday jacket, and one picture that nearly undid me. It was my grandson at 2 years old, round cheeks, eyes wide, gripping a toy truck in one hand, while the other clutched my arm. He looked at me like I was the center of his world. I realized, staring at that photo, that he would grow up without me. His memories of me would be shadows, stories twisted by others, not the truth of who I was or what I gave. The grief of that thought was sharper than anything I had felt before. But grief slowly hardened into resolve. I couldn't keep living as the ghost they made me. If they wanted me gone, then I would build a life on my own terms, not theirs. I refused to be pitied, refused to wither in the silence they left me in. I began clearing out my drawers and closets, setting aside what little of value I had. A pearl locket from my husband, the one he gave me on our 10th anniversary, I held in my hand for a long time. Parting with it felt like tearing away a piece of my heart. But I knew he would have told me to let go of the past to secure the future. I sold it along with a few antique sewing machines, my wedding china, and a set of gold earrings I had never worn. The money wasn't much, but it was enough to spark the beginning of something. I stood in my bare kitchen whispering to myself, "They may have shut the door, but they haven't shut my future." And with nothing left but my will, I stepped toward the unknown. With the little money I scraped together, I bought fabric remnants from discount bins and thrift stores. I sat at my old machine until my back ached, turning scraps into blouses and dresses styled after the vintage patterns I used to admire when I was young. At first I wasn't sure anyone would want them, but I packed a small rack with my pieces and rented a stall at the county fair. The first morning, I stood nervously behind my table while people wandered past. Then a woman stopped, ran her hand along the hem of a dress, and asked how much. When she handed me cash, I felt a spark I hadn't felt in years, proof that my hands still held value. By the end of the weekend, I had sold nearly everything I had made. That taste of possibility carried me forward. I took a part-time job at a small upholstery shop downtown. The owner, Mr. Fletcher, needed help sewing cushions, but I noticed the ledger on his desk was a mess. Numbers, scratched out invoices, misplaced supplier bills unpaid. I asked if he wanted me to straighten things up. Within a week, his books balanced, his accounts made sense, and he finally knew where his money was going. He shook his head in disbelief, muttering that I had saved him from drowning. Every day after work, I returned home to sew. I no longer stitched just for survival, I stitched with a plan. Word spread among fairgoers, and I started receiving small, custom orders. One Saturday, a woman in a tailored coat lingered at my booth. She introduced herself as the owner of a boutique 2 towns over. She examined each piece carefully, asked about my methods, then looked me square in the eye. "Would you consider consigning some of these? My customers would adore this style." The words hit me harder than any insult ever had, because they were the opposite, they were belief. I agreed, heart-pounding, and left that day with my first real contract. As I carried my garments into her shop the following week, I realized something. These stitches, small as they were, might be the beginning of something far greater than I had ever dared to imagine. The boutique sales gave me enough courage to take the next step. I signed a lease on a tiny storefront downtown, its paint peeling and windows smudged, but to me, it looked like a promise. Friends warned me it was too risky, that women my age should be winding down, not starting over. I smiled politely and signed anyway. The shop was bare when I moved in, just 4 walls and a creaky wooden counter, but I filled it with the hum of my sewing machine and the smell of freshly pressed fabric. I worked until midnight. Most nights, a pot of black coffee always at my side, my fingers moving steadily through yards of cloth. I kept the door propped open during the day, music playing softly, and people began to wander in out of curiosity. At first, it was one customer, then another, then whole groups of young women who whispered to each other as they flipped through the racks. They called my pieces revival style, a blend of old-world craftsmanship and something modern enough to feel fresh. When they told me my dresses made them feel strong and graceful at once, I tucked their words into my heart and stitched them into every garment I made. Business grew faster than I expected. Word spread beyond town, and soon women were driving in from neighboring cities to see my collection. I found myself struggling to keep up with demand, juggling orders and supplies. That was when I met Mrs. Armitage, a sharp-eyed woman at the Small Business Development Center. She looked over my numbers, asked a few pointed questions, and then told me what I didn't yet know. I wasn't just making clothes, I was running a business. She taught me how to price properly, how to market online, and even how to consider licensing designs so others could sew under my label. It felt overwhelming, but every lesson added strength to the foundation I was building. Each night, when I locked up my little shop and stepped out into the cool Ohio air, I felt something solid rooting me again. I was no longer surviving. I was creating. And I began to wonder if this was more than a business. Perhaps it was the beginning of an empire I never knew I had in me. 3 years after I turned the key in that worn wooden door, my boutique was not only surviving, but thriving. Sales doubled each season, and I reached a point where I could no longer manage everything alone. I hired 2 assistants, young women in their 20s, who reminded me of myself when I first started sewing out of desperation. They were eager, determined, and carrying their own quiet burdens. Training them wasn't just about business, it felt like passing on a piece of myself, a chance to give someone the break I once needed. The shop became a place of life and chatter, no longer a solitary space filled only by the hum of my machine. My online store gained momentum too. Orders began arriving from states I had never even visited, women writing notes about how my dresses made them feel beautiful, confident, or simply seen. Each package I shipped was more than fabric. It was my voice reaching places far beyond the borders of Ohio. For the first time in decades, money stopped being a shadow looming over me. I reinvested carefully, buying undervalued duplexes and small houses, fixing them up, and renting them out. I had learned the hard way that security came from many roots, not just one. Watching rent checks come in each month felt like proof that I was no longer at anyone's mercy. And yet, success has a way of ringing hollow when the people you long to share it with are absent. I would walk past a schoolyard, pausing to watch boys his age run across the grass, and I'd wonder if my grandson laughed like that, if he still had the habit of tugging at my sleeve when he wanted attention. He would be 10 now. In another life, I might have been on the bleachers clapping for him at a soccer game or bringing orange slices for his team. Instead, I stood outside the fence, a stranger in a life that should have been mine. Even surrounded by growth and momentum, that empty space inside me ached louder than any triumph. And it would echo still even as I prepared to take my boldest step yet. On my 71st birthday, I signed my name across the final line of the deed. The pen felt heavier than it should have, as if it carried not just ink, but every year I had been overlooked, underestimated, or erased. When the realtor slid the keys into my palm, I closed my fingers around them and felt something deeper than ownership vindication. The mansion was older than I was, a historic estate in the most prestigious neighborhood in town, a place I used to pass by from the bus window and never dream I'd enter. I didn't buy it for chandeliers or sweeping staircases. I bought it because I wanted proof that I had survived. Proof that the woman who was shoved onto a porch with 2 suitcases had not only endured, but risen higher than anyone believed possible. The first time I walked alone through its vast, echoing halls, the silence was almost too much. My footsteps bounced off walls lined with memory that wasn't mine yet. I paused in the grand foyer, and for a moment, it blurred into another doorway. The night I stood in the rain suitcase, in hand, my son's face averted, as his wife closed me out of their home. That night, I had thought my story was ending. Here, with the weight of the keys in my hand, I knew it was only the beginning. I wandered into the library, my hand brushing along shelves that begged for books for life. I stepped onto the balcony off the master bedroom, the town spread beneath me like a map. I had finally learned to read. From here, the modest streets where James and Jessica lived looked small. Once they had held the power to define my worth. Now they were just rooftops in the distance. I owned more space than I could ever need, but it wasn't about filling it with things. It was about filling it with the dignity I had been denied. I sat on the wide stone steps that evening, the sun sinking behind the trees, and let the quiet wash over me. It wouldn't stay quiet for long. The family that cast me aside was about to learn exactly how far I had come. The morning after I moved into the mansion, the doorbell rang. I hadn't even finished my first cup of coffee. The chime echoed through the marble foyer, clear and insistent. When I checked the monitor, my breath caught. There they were, James, Jessica, and two tall teenagers who looked like strangers, wearing the faces of the children I once held. I opened the front door just enough to see them clearly. James shifted on his feet, hair grayer now. Shoulders slumped. Jessica wore a blazer too crisp for a casual visit. Her smile stretched thin like a mask. The girl Emma stood behind them, her sharp features softened by uncertainty. The boy Tony I remembered had James's eyes only taller. Now his gaze flicking past me to the glimpse of the foyer beyond. Jessica stepped forward, her voice bright and false. Maggie. Oh, sorry, Salandra. We heard about your new place. It's gorgeous. And, well, since you've got all this room we're moving in, the audacity of it nearly made me laugh. I kept the screen door closed and leaned my hand against it, letting the pause stretch. Moving in, I repeated slowly. James cleared his throat. Just until we get back on our feet. Things have been tight. I looked from one to the other, letting the silence weigh heavy. 5 years I begged to see my grandson, 5 years of birthdays and Christmases, without a call. Now they stood on my porch as if none of it had happened. I let them squirm under my gaze. Jessica's smile twitched. James dropped his eyes the way he had the day he turned me out. At last I unlatched the door and stepped back, but not with welcome. Come in, I said, my voice flat. They shuffled inside, trying not to gawk at the chandelier overhead, at the polished floors under their shoes. I closed the door behind them and faced them squarely in the foyer. You wanted to talk, I said, my eyes never leaving theirs. Then let's talk. The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of all that had been left unsaid. It was time to confront the people who had erased me and now dared to need me. We gathered in the foyer like it was a courtroom. James shifted from foot to foot, eyes darting around the room as if the grandeur itself embarrassed him. Jessica crossed her arms, her voice cutting the air. We've had a hard year. James lost his job. The mortgage is behind, and with Emma's college applications. Well, you can imagine the strain. We thought since you have this big place, James interrupted, his voice low. Mom, we just need a little time here, just until things settle. He wouldn't look me in the eye. I folded my hands and waited. Their words spilled out excuses, layered on top of one another, but I heard nothing that sounded like remorse. Just need, just want, just take. Jessica's tone sharpened with each sentence, her mask slipping, the moment she sensed she wasn't getting what she expected. Finally, I turned away from the two of them and looked at the children. They stood awkwardly, uncertain, caught between the story they'd been told and the reality before them. My voice softened. Do you know why you don't remember me? Why I wasn't there for birthdays? Recitals, holidays? Emma frowned. Dad said you moved away. That you didn't want to be part of things. Tony nodded, adding, They said you abandoned us. The words stung, but I steadied myself. That's not true. I was banned. 5 years ago, your parents told me never to come back. I left with 2 suitcases and less than $1,000 to my name. I lived in motels. I worked wherever I could. And from that, nothing I rebuilt. This house, this business, everything I have, I built it because they erased me. Emma's eyes widened, anger flashing in her face. Tony's jaw tightened. So, they lied to us, he asked quietly. Neither James nor Jessica answered. Emma stepped forward, her voice trembling, but sure. Grandma? Can we come back to visit you? Without them. I felt my throat tighten. Any time, I said, holding her gaze. In that moment, I knew the control Jessica once held was slipping through her fingers, and it was the children themselves who broke it. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I looked at James and Jessica, both of them still standing stiffly in my foyer, and said clearly, This house isn't yours. It never will be. Jessica opened her mouth, but I lifted a hand to stop her. You made your choices. You told me to figure out my life on my own. I did. Now you'll have to figure out yours. Don't ask me for money. Don't ask me for space. Don't ask me for favors. If you want to be in my life, you'll need to show me honesty and change, not demands. James's shoulders slumped. He muttered something about stress about mistakes, but I saw no true apology. Jessica's face was tight, her smile gone, her eyes sharp as glass. She was not used to being denied. I turned from them and bent down to Emma and Tony. But you two, I said softly. My door will always be open. No matter what your parents say, you're welcome here. I've missed too much already, and I won't miss another day if I can help it. Emma's eyes brimmed with tears as she nodded. Tony gave a small, fierce smile, the kind I remembered from James when he was young. I wrapped my arms around both of them, holding them tight, as if to make up for the years stolen from us. Jessica huffed, tugging at James's sleeve. We're leaving, she snapped. He followed, defeated, the sound of the heavy front door closing behind them, like the final note of a song long overdue. The house grew quiet again, but this time, the silence was mine. I carried my coffee to the tall window overlooking the grounds, the morning light spilling across acres I had earned with my own hands. I breathed it in, steady and certain. Family isn't who locks you out, it's who opens the door when you knock, I said aloud, letting the truth settle in the air around me. I sipped my coffee and felt the weight lift. When family tries to erase you, you can fade into nothing, or you can build a life so bright they can never ignore you again.